I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival and to our panel, The Future of the Death Penalty. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. Elsa Alcala is the Policy Director for the Texas Defender Service. She previously served for 7 years on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and 9 years on the First Court of Appeals. Maurice Chammah is a staff writer at the Marshall Project. His first book, Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty, will be published in January. Joe Gonzales is the elected district attorney of Bexar County. Mr. Gonzales previously worked as both a trial prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. I wanted to direct my first question to you, DA Gonzales. When you first took office in January of last year, you inherited approximately 50 cases that were death penalty eligible. And I'm hoping you can tell me what you did with those cases, which I think is a departure from the past, at least from a generation ago or so, and tell us why you did what you did.
Sure. Well, thank you, and I'm happy to be here with these outstanding panelists. I will tell you, as you mentioned, that we had about 50 cases ready for our review, capital murder cases, to determine whether or not we would seek the death penalty on those cases. I immediately formed a capital crimes committee that is comprised of 10 division chiefs as well as myself. We review all of these cases together, and although every member of that committee has a vote, I have the ultimate say on whether to seek the death penalty. And we have been doing that once a month for about 12 months, for an entire year until this pandemic slowed us down. But I will tell you that in that year that we have been doing this, we have now reviewed 42 cases, and of the 42 cases, we have only sought death on 2. One of those has already been resolved with life without parole. So the bottom line is we've only sought death in about 5% of the total 42 cases that we have reviewed. And the question as to why, there are 2 reasons, I think. One is primarily my philosophy. I said when I was campaigning, and I continue to say in the office, that I'm reserving capital murder death penalty decisions for only the worst of the worst. And while I'm not ready to say that I'll never use the death penalty, I certainly am using it only in those instances where I believe that the situation calls for that. That, in addition to the fact that we now have life without parole, I think that's a significant difference to when I first started as a young prosecutor 30 years ago.
More about life without parole and how much that changed things. Let me just follow up by asking you, what got you to the point of wanting to deal with death penalty eligible cases in this, I think, very thoughtful way? I think at one point you worked for Johnny Holmes in the Harris County DA's office, which had a different culture. What sort of brought you to that point that you're at now?
I think it's an evolution as a young lawyer. When I first started, as you mentioned, I did spend 3 years in the DA's office in Harris County, about the same time that Judge Alcala was there. And one of the things that I learned was that this certainly was one way to handle it, and I thought that can't be the right way to do it. Not everybody deserves death with these kinds of cases, and so that's an evolution I've had over the years. And I've learned my philosophy now again is it ought only be reserved for the worst of the worst. And I think part of it is because lawyers can get it wrong, juries can get it wrong, and the death penalty is such an ultimate result. And so what happens if you do? You can't bring that person back to life. If really the purpose of punishment is to keep that person from committing those kinds of crimes, if that person is going to take his last breath in prison, haven't you done enough by removing that person from society? And so that's part of the reason that now that's formed my philosophy about the death penalty. And I will continue to use it only in those cases where I think it's absolutely necessary.
Thank you so much. Question to you to just give us an overview of where we are now. We talked about DA Gonzales's evolution, and there's been an evolution in many ways in our state as well. So 20 years ago, 48 death sentences were handed down in Texas. Last year, 4 death sentences were handed down. For people who don't follow this issue as closely as we all do, Can you explain a little bit about what's changed in that time? What's different and what's happened in the past 20 years?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. So there are a lot of different reasons why the death penalty has sort of disappeared over the years, and sort of very smart people debate the proportions of these different ingredients. But the ones I think to highlight are sort of, first of all, crime went down. There was a lot more crime in the 80s and 90s. Trump and some of our political figures talk about these sort of murder spikes happening in big cities, and that is true, but that's in the context of a much larger decline. There's far fewer murders than there were in the 80s and 90s. As a result, there's also a lot less public fear of crime. The death penalty is a sort of symbolic response to crime. It always affected a very small number of cases, but it was a way that governors, the presidents, that elected district attorneys could communicate to voters that they were very serious about crime. Crime became less of a priority. Some people have argued to me that 9/11 sort of shifted the fear of the American public when it came to public safety away from crime and towards terrorism, which obviously also involves the death penalty sometimes, but is just a much more rare occurrence. And then you had the 2000 election, which, Governor Bush, I'll sort of take you back, Governor George Bush of Texas was running for president. And the Texas death penalty system became kind of an oddity on the national stage. There were a lot of big last-minute fights over whether someone innocent was going to maybe be executed, whether everyone who was getting executed really deserved it. There was a scandal involving a man on death row whose lawyer fell asleep at his trial. All of this was very embarrassing for Texas, and a lot of politicians have told me that they kind of came back to the legislature in 2001 caring a lot more about, are we maybe executing people who didn't even commit the crime or innocent? Are all of the people on death row, do they really deserve to be there? Are they the worst of the worst, as Diego Gonzales just said? Pam, you yourself have written about a lot of these sort of big innocence cases of people who are on death row despite sort of overwhelming evidence that they didn't commit the crime. And then the last reason I think worth highlighting that's maybe the least known of all of these, people have heard about innocence cases, maybe remember the 2000 election, but these cases are also very expensive. In Bexar County, in Harris County, in Dallas, it's part of a much larger DA's office budget. But in some small towns, county officials have told me that it can just break the bank completely. There's a very famous case in which a Black man, James Byrd, was murdered in the late 90s in Jasper. And this case made international headlines, of course, but the taxpayers in Jasper, their tax rate went up. And the local officials compared the death penalty trials to, a hurricane that wipes out roads and bridges, and you have to pump, hundreds of thousands of dollars into. All of that leads to the point where these small town district attorneys came to the legislature and kind of begged the legislature in 2005 to pass a life without parole law. Texas was among the last states, if not the last one, to pass one. And it meant that prosecutors had a sort of sufficiently harsh alternative to the death penalty to offer to juries and the public. And now I think what will come from that is a debate about whether life without parole is actually more lenient than whether life without parole is actually more lenient than the death penalty, because I've also heard people say that in some ways it's worse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Given that, my next question is for Judge Alcala. Given that really fascinating trajectory of how our state what it's traveled over the past 20 years, I'm still struck by the fact that when polling is done of Texans, this is still a very staunchly pro-death penalty state. And so, Judge Alcala, I wanted to ask you both about your own personal journey with this issue, because over the years it's evolved, and what you think that would sort of capture hearts and minds of Texans and maybe change their opinion in the way that yours has been changed over the years.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be as part of this panel. I do want to clarify that I'm no longer with the Texas Defender Service. I'm now a solo practitioner, and I primarily am doing pro bono work to help lawyers assigned to death penalty cases. As far as my trajectory, I began as a prosecutor, and I sought the death penalty in 3 different cases and obtained it in 2 cases. I was in favor of the death penalty, and I worked under Johnny Holmes when Johnny Holmes was frequently seeking death in many cases. Along the way, I went to the trial court bench, then the Court of Appeals bench, and then ultimately to the Court of Criminal Appeals, When I got to the Court of Criminal Appeals, that's when I was directly reviewing the appeals and habeas challenges in death penalty cases. And that's where my opinion began to change. I saw too many cases where defense counsel had been completely ineffective at the guilt innocence stage and at the punishment stage. And when those complaints were brought to my court, I too often saw a court that was willing to overlook all of those mistakes and affirm the conviction, regardless of the quality of representation. And it was issue after issue like that that struck me as an unfair and arbitrary system. I began to question the prevalence of race in who was getting the death penalty. Most recently, there was a study of Harris County cases. This study was released in the last few weeks, I believe, that showed that if a defendant killed a white woman, then that defendant was 3 times more likely to get the death sentence than otherwise. So you see over and over again the correlation between the death penalty and race, or the death penalty and the quality of representation. Too often you see junk science that was used to get the death penalty. I wrote a dissenting opinion that made its way to the United States Supreme Court in Moore v. Texas, where the court said that Texas had been using the standard for intellectual disability incorrectly for over a decade, and people had been executed under that incorrect legal standard for intellectual disability. Since Moore v. Texas was decided, I believe there's 6 people's death sentences that have been commuted to life. So it has had an impact in Texas, but unfortunately, there were people who were executed under that incorrect standard. I saw how we are spending millions of dollars the state is spending millions of dollars to get death sentences against individuals. But when you look at that crime and that criminal history, and you compare it to all those people who either got life or something else for those crimes, what you see is this arbitrary system where you just can't make sense of why this person got the death sentence or got executed, and why of these 1,000 other murders that happened in Texas, why those people didn't get the death sentence. So I could talk all day about why my opinion changed, but I have now formed the opinion that we should not be executing. We shouldn't be seeking death against anyone, and we certainly should not be executing anyone because of the risk of executing an innocent person, and because of all of the problems that I mentioned that make the system too unfair to be reliable.
Thank you so much. You touched upon the randomness of the death penalty and the way it's administered, which leads me to a question I have for DA Gonzales. I'm struck that for many years, death sentences were a source of pride for prosecutors. And I'm wondering if you think that part of the key to reducing the number of death sentences in America will involve changing the culture in some DA's offices. And I think we all know sort of the counties in Texas that I'm thinking of with this question, but what would it take, and what does that involve? What sort of culture shift might be necessary?
Well, I definitely think that it is a culture in not only prosecutors' offices, but other areas of law of criminal justice and law enforcement and judiciary as well. I mean, I think we see a lot of judges that have been elevated to the bench from prior careers in the DA's office, and I think for a lot of them, success and promotions were based on the amount of convictions that they got. And I dare say that some prosecutors took pride in the number of successful death penalty cases. I know in our situation, when I first came into office, there was a particular prosecutor who no longer works here, does not work for me, who took pride in seeking out these kinds of cases with the idea that he wanted that a death sentence to be another notch on his belt. And I don't think that that's the way prosecutors ought to look at seeking the death penalty. They ought to look at it in terms of whether or not it's the appropriate punishment, whether it's the right thing to do, not whether or not it's going to advance your career and be a cause for promotion to a higher position in the office. And so, yes, that is a culture that should change, and we're trying to do something to change that. It's easier to convince the younger prosecutors that that's not the correct way to think than some of the old prosecutors that have been here, that have been here for 20, 30 years. But I think even they realize the trend, not only in Texas, but across the country, is to abandon this as the ultimate resolution.
Very quick follow-up question to that. I'm guessing that another ingredient is the conversation that you had perhaps as you were going through all these cases last year and this year with victims' families. And I'm wondering if you can, whatever you feel comfortable with telling us about that, how do you negotiate that if a victim's family very much wants the death penalty?
Well, I mean, that's probably the hardest part of this is sitting down with the family and explaining to them why I'm making this ultimate decision. And it's tough to do because some of the families that are left behind in situations like that want this as the ultimate resolution. You certainly have family members that believe in an eye for an eye. But I think for the most part, we've been able to sit with families and explain to them why I'm making this decision. And by and large, once they realize that these individuals are facing life without parole, that they're never going to do this to anybody else out in the community, that is sufficient for most of them. So while you may have one or two that still feel strongly about it, the large majority of the family members that we've met with accept why I'm making this decision.
Judge Alcala, I wanted to ask you, given that the death penalty is likely to remain the law of the land in Texas for the foreseeable future, what are the one or two biggest changes you'd like to see in the administration of the death penalty at this time?
It's a hard question because of the volume of issues that are involved. One of the bills that we proposed that made it to the Senate but didn't make it out of committee was an out-of-time motion for new trial that would allow a post-conviction new trial when the DA and the defense and the judge all agreed that a new trial was appropriate and that it was in the interest of justice. The point behind that in the death penalty context is that we see today DAs who are trying to do the right thing. For example, I believe Joe Gonzales is trying to do the right thing. You see the Dallas DA Crusoe doing the right thing, Brian Middleton. You can name several others who truly are acting, I believe, in the interest of justice. The problem is that right now you've got over 200 people on death row who got to death row under systems that I believe were not as fair as they are today. So what happens is a DA like Joe Gonzales is in a situation where a defendant is on death row. He may look at that case and he may see a procedure or facts or something that cause him to question the reliability of that conviction or that make him think, if this thing happened today, this guy would not be on death row. We wouldn't even be seeking death. We would be pleading him out to life without parole or life stacked on life or something. But we would resolve this without death. But yet, because that person got to death row under the prior system, there he sits. And the problem is that there is no legal mechanism for reaching out and modifying that sentence from death to life unless you have something like new evidence that couldn't have been obtained at the time of trial or in the earlier habeas cases, or you have some newly discovered constitutional violation is what it's going to take. And you may have some new evidence, but it doesn't rise to that standard. It's either not constitutional, or it's not, or it could have been discovered before. So you have a situation where you don't have the technical elements to go and get habeas relief that's going to cause a commutation from death to life. But you look at the case and you know that the right thing, the moral thing, the right thing, the correct thing is to modify the sentence from death to life. And that is, I think, what struck me. One of the main things that struck me was when I was on the court was that I was seeing the wrong outcome, but having some difficulty trying to find a way to reach in and legally, mechanically, procedurally get to something that's going to cause that commutation. So a motion for new trial that's, again, by the agreement of the defense, the prosecutor, and the judge, in the interest of justice, I believe should be permitted at any time post-conviction, because those are people who are trying to act in the interest of justice. But we found that there were senators, current elected senators, who frankly just said, well, we don't trust the current prosecutors to do this, which I found completely offensive. But their view was that basically current elected prosecutors were not tough enough in their minds, and so they opposed that legislation. But I think that would go a very long way in reaching justice and in trying to correct bad outcomes from the past based on prosecutions with bad science, or that you see a racial component that might have led to the sentence, or any number of things that the elected prosecutor can see and wants to do something to rectify in order to get to justice. But that did not pass, and that was unfortunate, because I think it would be important for Texas.
Thank you so much. Maurice, you found something fascinating to me in the course of researching your book I wanted to ask you about. You found that death sentences declined in part because defense attorneys learned how to humanize their defendants in the courtroom. Can you talk a little bit about this, and more broadly, how harnessing that kind of approach could help reduce the number of people in prison overall and address the sort of issue of mass incarceration that we're now talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the cases in the book that I spent a lot of time on, found really fascinating, was in 2008. It was in Harris County, and an undocumented immigrant had murdered a police officer. He had snuck back into the country after having been deported. He had been accused in the past of sexually assaulting a child. I mean, it was really the worst set of facts you could possibly imagine. And the defense attorney in that case sent a team of people into Mexico to learn every possible fact they could about this man's life. They interviewed, kids he went to elementary school with and third cousins, this sort of massive number of people. And they used that research to tell a story about the sort of young, struggling man who had come to America seeking a better life and escaping abuse, and in a moment of panic had murdered this police officer and felt immediately horribly remorseful about it. And there were plenty of people, of course, who disagreed with that narrative, with that framing of this man, but it was just compelling enough that the jury voted to sentence him to life without parole instead of the death penalty. And in thinking about that case and what it led to, which was, this was right as Harris County was starting to have a huge decline in death sentences, defense lawyers were bringing similar information to prosecutors and saying, you might not win at trial because I can convince the jury to, grant mercy to this man. So prosecutors would say, okay, well, we'll just, foreclose the trial happening at all and let this person go to life in prison and save the money, et cetera. So as all of that happened, I started realizing that, that approach doesn't have to just stay in the context of the death penalty. And I started learning that the investigators who do this sort of work and the defense attorneys who specialize in it are now training public defenders around the country who do all kinds of cases, very serious cases, rapes, robberies, beyond the death penalty cases. And it's slowly leading to a kind of cultural shift where when someone commits a really terrible crime, our response is not only punish them, it's also, how did this happen? What sets of factors in this person's life? What institutional problems with their education or mental health or addiction led them to the point where they did something terrible? And it sort of opens the door for thinking in more creative ways about rehabilitation and even redemption for some people who commit very serious crimes. I think this is especially crucial now that there's an ongoing conversation about what we call mass incarceration, the incredibly large number of people in prison in the United States. And you often hear a kind of narrative that, you know, if you just let everyone out who smoked a joint and got busted by the police, we would reduce the prison population a great deal. That's really not that true, right? And in reality, roughly half of the people in prison, in state prisons around the country, are there for something that has been deemed violent, a violent crime. And so in order to truly reduce the number of people in prison over the long term, we're going to have to think more creatively about redemption and rehabilitation. And I think what's so striking and what we can take from this death penalty history is some lessons in how lawyers have learned basically what you need to do in order to humanize somebody for a jury, for the public, for the legal system in general.
Thank you. It's so fascinating and interesting. I would love to talk about that more, but we have time for one more very, very quick question before we end. The pandemic, I'm going to direct this to all of you for last question. The pandemic has led to the postponement of capital trials and numerous days of execution. What do you all think will happen when we return to business as usual, whenever that is?
We, as I mentioned, we have one case that is pending, and it just happens to be in the court where the presiding judge is making decisions about whether or not to delay panels being brought to the courthouse during this pandemic. We now know that we don't expect panels to be returning until sometime early next year. However, we've already been informed that we're going to start specific voir dire on this case sometime around the holidays. So at least with regard to that particular case, that judge believes that we need to keep that moving forward. And so I think what's going to happen is when we get to the point where we start having in-person dockets again, when we start having to deal with serious cases, because we have a number of non-death capital murder cases that are currently set for trial, they're going to have to be tried, and that's going to have to happen. So there has been delays while we've been a lot of us working from home, sheltering in place. We do expect that when we get back to normal, we're going to have to deal with this backlog, not only with capital murder cases, but everything else that's been backing up.
Judge Alcala, is there anything you want to add to that? Do you think things will look any different when we come out on the other side of this?
So the court has reset, the Court of Criminal Appeals has reset 8 executions in 2020, but there was one execution that did occur, Billy Wardlow, in July, which was an odd thing because they reset everything before and after his, but for whatever reason permitted his, which is unusual. I think courts are working hard. They're not going to be able to get many cases tried just because of the backlog. But 3 executions are already set for 2021. So I think we'll see executions resume in Texas at some point in 2021. And I hope the takeaway is from all of this is that there were only 3 executions in Texas in 2020, and we are no more safe or no more dangerous with or without those executions. There's no point in the death penalty and executions. It has no effect on our safety or on people committing crimes or anything else. And I hope people will realize that we're spending a lot of time and money and effort for little to no impact on our safety of our community.
Thank you so much to all of these amazing panelists. I really appreciate you all taking the time to talk about this, and thank you everybody for watching. Appreciate it.